Hello. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with you. I remember the first time I ever heard of Tibet. I was in the 6th or the 7th grade, and I came across a Ripley's Believe It or Not comic book at a friend's house. Okay, this may seem to date me. Ripley's comics were most famous in the 1930s and 40s. The one I saw would have been a reprint in the 70s. Among those comic book panels of natural and human wonders was a description of Tibetan monks who used the tops of human skulls as cups and human thigh bones as flutes. It seemed very strange and more than a little eerie. That may well have been the first time I had ever heard of Buddhism, which probably was not the best introduction to the religion. First of all, I didn't know about the Buddha or his enlightenment and the Four Noble Truths. That's the place to start. Second, I had no way of making sense of such a bizarre practice as drinking out of a bowl made of a skull, for example. By the end of this lecture, you'll at least understand the thinking behind it. And third, I didn't realize that I had tapped into a rich vein of Western romanticism and sensationalism about Tibet that went back to the 19th century and then forward into the 1930s, when the novelist James Hilton coined the phrase Shangri-La. For example, Sherlock Holmes was supposed to have spent 2 of his lost years in Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism, or Vajrayana, is an esoteric tradition which does include things that may at first seem strange, but to focus on those elements ignores the remarkable philosophical and scholarly accomplishments that are also part of that branch of the religion. And finally, although Tibetan Buddhism gets a lot of attention in the West, especially since the annexation of Tibet by China and the flight of the Dalai Lama and many of his followers to India in 1959, adherents of Vajrayana only number about 20 million out of perhaps 400 million Buddhists around the world, so maybe 5%. Numerically, Tibetan Buddhism is not terribly significant, though in terms of scholarship, it is enormously important. The term Vajrayana means the thunderbolt, or the diamond vehicle, and this is the 3rd major Buddhist tradition after Theravada, the way of the elders, and Mahayana, the great vehicle. The term Vajra refers to the legendary thunderbolt weapon of the Hindu god Indra, which was thought to be indestructible, like a diamond. It also refers to a small, scepter-like object with 5 curved prongs at each end, and it's used in rituals. Vajrayana began in India in the 6th or the 7th centuries when tantric techniques were added to Mahayana philosophy. Now, tantrism refers to physical or mental actions that can facilitate or accelerate the journey to enlightenment. Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism, is today mostly found in Tibet, but there's also an important offshoot in Japan known as Shingon. I translated it's the true word school. One of the things that makes Tibetan Buddhism distinct is that it has its own canon. As you may remember from an earlier lecture, the Tibetan canon is one of the 3 major collections of Buddhist sacred texts, the others being the Pali canon of Theravada Buddhism in 48 volumes, and the Chinese canon of 100 volumes, which is also used in Japan and in Korea. The Tibetan canon, however, weighs in at 322 volumes, and it includes many translations of Sanskrit texts that otherwise have been lost. We'll come back to this in a few moments. Buddhism first came to Tibet at the time of Sonzen Gampo, an early 7th century king who had married 2 Buddhist princesses, one from Nepal and the other from China. Under his direction, a Tibetan script was developed based on Sanskrit so that translations could begin. Buddhism wasn't particularly influential, however, until the late 8th century, when another king invited an Indian monk to establish a monastery. Buddhists soon faced intense hostility from the native Tibetan religion of Bon. And this religion has lots of gods and demons and magical spells and shamanism. The king, the Tibetan king invited an Indian tantric master named Padmasambhava to duel with demons and bone priests through spectacular feats of magic. This was the legendary first dissemination of Buddhism into Tibet, and it's associated with the Nyingma sect, the oldest school of Tibetan Buddhism. Tradition reports that about this time, so about 792 of the Common Era, the king ordered a public debate between Chinese Buddhists, who were proponents of sudden enlightenment and paying less attention to the scriptures, basically kind of like Zen Buddhism. And on the other hand were Indian Buddhists, and they were arguing for the Bodhisattva path of gradually refined wisdom and compassion. The Indian Buddhists won the debate, but then another period of persecution followed not long after. Finally, in the 10th century, more monks were coming from India, bringing a second dissemination of Buddhism into Tibet. And then that picked up momentum with the arrival of Atisha, the great monk, in 1042. Atisha, who was an accomplished scholar, had been the dean of Nalanda University in India, and he valued the discipline and the insights of early forms of Buddhism, such as Theravada, along with Mahayana philosophy and its emphasis on the Bodhisattva path. And he also had an appreciation for the latest tantric techniques. He founded the Kadam school of Tibetan Buddhism, which was later followed by the Kagyu school and the Sakya school. Yeah, you can tell that this is kind of a complicated story. Buddhist monks fleeing the Muslim conquest of India carried new scriptures when they came to Tibet, and eventually those new scriptures were translated and then canonized. Indeed, one of the great achievements of this second dissemination was the compilation of one of the world's largest collections of scripture. The Tibetan canon consists of two parts. The first is the Kangyur, and this is the translation of the word of the Buddha, and it consists of over 600 texts in 98 volumes, including 13 volumes of Vinaya and 13 volumes of sutras. About 3/4 of those sutras are Mahayana sutras, and then 21 volumes of perfection of wisdom texts, and finally 22 volumes of Tantra, and there's a dozen more volumes of odds and ends thrown in. The second, much longer part of the Tibetan canon is the Tengyur, and these are translations of treatises. These consist of works by individual Indian masters, and they're divided into commentaries on the sutras and commentaries on the tantras, more than 3,600 texts in 224 volumes. And then there's a large body of commentaries written by the Tibetans themselves, which are not included in the canon. Tibetan Buddhism has a rich tradition of scholarship in Buddhist philosophy and logic. You may have noticed two of the three Theravada baskets in the Tangyur, the Vinaya and the Sutras. The third basket, the Abhidharma, and remember that's philosophical analysis of the constituent elements of phenomena in the mind. So the Abhidharma is absent from the Kangyur, but it's approached in the Tibetan Buddhism through texts in the Tengyur, which include Abhidharma commentaries, as well as many of the classics of Indian Buddhist philosophy translated into Tibetan. These would be works by Asanga, the founder of the Yogacara, or the mind-only school, or works by Nagarjuna, the founder of the Madhyamaka, or Middle Way school. One influential, relatively accessible example of a Buddhist text written for Tibetans is Atisha's Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, which is a masterpiece of synthesis at only 68 verses, and it combines the ethics of Theravada Buddhism, the ethics of the Theravada Vinaya, the philosophy of Mahayana, perfections of wisdoms, and the tantric rituals of Vajrayana. This scripture, with a commentary written by Atisha himself, was included in the Tengyur section of the Tibetan canon. Atisha addresses his words to those who seek enlightenment not just to end their personal suffering, but to benefit all beings. So this is the Bodhisattva path. Atisha says, since you want to free these beings from the suffering of pain, from suffering and the cause of suffering, arouse immutably the resolve to attain enlightenment. Ideally, one should take this vow to become a bodhisattva from a teacher, and Atisha stresses that the best path forward is that of a monk who purifies body and speech and mind through strict morality and discipline. This is the Vinaya part of this text. By practicing meditation, calm abiding, and higher perceptions will arise. Atisha further explains the necessary combination of skillful means and wisdom, noting that, as he says, wisdom is fully explained as knowing the emptiness of own being in the non-arising of the five aggregates, the sense fields and elements of existence. Samsara arises from conceptual thought. The complete removal of that conceptual thought is the highest nirvana. Atisha ends by acknowledging the efficacy of mantras, actions, and performances under the direction of a teacher or a guru. So this is the tantric part of that. But Atisha warns, even though monks can study the tantras and make offerings, they are not allowed to receive secret or wisdom initiations. To do so would result in breaking their vows, in defeat. Remember, that's the worst category of offenses in the Vinaya. And it would result in bad rebirths for the monks. Okay, what's going on here? And why would aiming at enlightenment be bad for a monk? What does Atisha have in mind when he's warning against certain types of tantric practices? And with this, we get to some of the stranger elements of Tibetan Buddhism. The key term here is Tantrism, which refers to a type of Buddhism that arose in India in the 6th or the 7th centuries and combined Mahayana doctrines with secret rituals or practices that offered shortcuts to enlightenment. The Bodhisattva path could take many lifetimes to complete with its 6 perfections. You remember those are generosity, morality, patience, exertion, meditation, and wisdom. One of those 6 perfections is perfect meditation, which was generally understood to mean stilling the mind and the body. Tantric teachers, by contrast, urge students to put the body and the mind to work through mudras, those are ritual postures or gestures, mantras, sacred sounds or phrases, mandalas, and those are sacred symbolic diagrams, and visualizations of multiple gods and goddesses. If you think this sounds like things we've already encountered in Hindu texts, you're right. There are also tantric forms of Hinduism. Tantrism is active rather than quiescent or passive. It uses physical and mental functions to transcend the body and the mind. It's sort of like using fire to fight fire, or desire to overcome desire. It may remind us of the Lotus Sutra, where the merchant's father, where the father of that burning house appealed to his son's desire for carts in order to rescue them from the danger that they were in. So you can use desire in order to help people escape from desire. Mahayana perfection of wisdom texts teach that in the end, there's no difference between samsara and nirvana, that attachment and aversion are both traps, that anything and everything can be a manifestation of the Buddha's Dharma body. Remember the doctrine of the 3 bodies of the Buddha. And the Dharma body is ultimate reality that encompasses everything. Tantrism takes those insights and then puts them into action. So you can see how using a bowl that was fashioned from a human skull without it bothering you in the least, or blowing a horn made from a human bone with perfect calmness, might demonstrate that one has stepped beyond ordinary conceptions. One has moved into that realm of non-duality, where one realizes that the kind of distinctions we normally make are artificial and that everything ultimately is emptiness. Tantrism is also known for rituals that involve drinking wine or eating meat in a cemetery at night. So this is going to go against ordinary taboos. Many forms of Buddhism encourage vegetarianism. Not all of them, but some of them. Though all Buddhists should subscribe to the 5 precepts. And remember, the 5th one is no intoxicants. So in this case, there are some practices that seem to go against ordinary Buddhist morality. There are some tantric practices that even encourage engaging in sexual behavior without desire. while visualizing one's partner as a deity. It's easy to see how such practices might be abused as well, which is why it's crucial that they're undertaken under the direction of a qualified guru. And the word guru is translated as lama in Tibetan. You may recall the classic Ogden Nash poem about one-eled and two-eled lamas. Here we're talking about the one-eled lama, the priest, not the beast. Another reason why expert guidance is needed is that tantric texts are often written in cryptic language that's unintelligible to outsiders. It's an esoteric tradition, a secret transmission. And it's often unclear whether the rituals that are described in these texts are only meant to be visualized in meditation or physically performed. Many tantric practices require an idam, that is, a holy being chosen for a particular worshiper, appropriate to his or her nature. These deities may be male or female, they may be wrathful or peaceful. And it's common to categorize tantras into 4 stages. The first are action tantras, where adherents visualize themselves as servants of meditational deities and offer their devotions. The second type are performance tantras, in which one sees oneself as equal to a deity, like a friend, and where one perceives his or her own potential as enlightened bodhisattvas. The third type are yoga tantras, or the gradual identification with deities to gain their perfections and wisdom. So we're going from equality to identification. And then the fourth kind of tantra is supreme yoga. That is being transformed into a bodhisattva by learning to control energy channels and centers and winds and drops within one's subtle body. And there are lots of instructions about how to do this. One experiences the bliss of union of the self and other, of wisdom and compassion, which may be visualized as the sexual union of male and female. Some forms of supreme yoga might involve ritualized sexual intercourse with spouses in the case of lay Buddhists or Nyingmapa lamas who are permitted to marry. Monks in other sects of Tibetan Buddhism who have undertaken vows of celibacy are only allowed to visualize such actions. Okay, this seems to be what Atisha was worried about in his Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, that some monks would move beyond visualizations to actually enact some of these practices. I mentioned earlier that about 1/5 of the Kangyur, the first part of the Tibetan canon, consists of tantric texts, some 22 volumes worth. They feature a profusion of mantras, so those are incantations and magical spells. They also have mudras, ritualized hand gestures, and mandalas, those mystical diagrams, all of which can put one in tune with an idam, one's chosen deity, and provide a focus for meditation and visualization. For just one example, we can turn to the Hivajra Tantra, which is very influential in the Sakya school, and which was the first major tantra to be published in English in 1959. Hivajra, a popular chosen deity of the wrathful variety, is often depicted with multiple arms holding weapons and skull bowls, and he's embracing a female consort and standing on a lotus and a corpse. The Tantra offers detailed instructions for multiple rituals and visualizations, explaining that from self-experiencing comes this knowledge, which is free from ideas of self and other. Like the sky, it is pure and void, the essence supreme of non-existence and existence, a mingling of wisdom and skillful means, a mingling of passion and absence of passion. The Hivajra Sutra continues, then the master should enter the mandala as a two-armed Hivajra, and assuming the majestic bearing of a Vajrasattva, he should adopt the Alida posture. He is washed and purified and perfumed and adorned with the various adornments. Hum, hum, he cries majestically. He cries to terrify. Then the essence is declared, pure and consisting in knowledge, where there is not the slightest difference between samsara and nirvana. Okay, some of the imagery from that text seems to break taboos. It goes on to say, into the mandala, one should cause to enter the 8 blissful spells, 12 or 16 years of age, and adorned with necklaces and bangles. They are called wife, sister, daughter, niece, mother-in-law, aunt, etc. He should cause them to drink camphor, and he should quickly gain siddhi, which are magical powers. Wine is drunk, and meat and herbs are eaten. Next, he removes their garments and kisses them again and again. They honor him in return and sing and dance to their best, and they play there together in the union of Vajra and lotus. Okay, I don't really understand what's going on there, but then again, I'm not supposed to. This is written for insiders, and you need a qualified guru or a lama to take you through it. One more quote from the Vajra Tantra. Those things that bind people of evil conduct, others use as skillful means to gain freedom from the bonds of samsara. The world is bound by passion, but by passion too it can be freed. Once again, the world is bound by passion, but by passion too it can be freed. Okay, this raises an interesting question that applies to many religions, and not just Buddhism. Is the body a hindrance or a help to spiritual progress and salvation, however one might define salvation? Is the body something that needs to be overcome in asceticism, or is it something that can be used? Is it necessary for spiritual progress? Indeed, that's one of the questions that first started the Buddha on his spiritual path, where he was an ascetic for a while, giving up eating and living a very restricted life. And then he decided that that wasn't working out quite so well. Of course, his earlier life of being a prince in a palace and enjoying everything in life hadn't worked out. And Buddhism was the middle way. He found the right balance between asceticism and an ordinary life, between not having passions and having passions. Thus far, I haven't talked about the most famous text of Vajrayana Buddhism, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That's probably because most Tibetans have probably never heard of it. It's much better known in the West than in Tibet. How can that be? The story of the Tibetan Book of the Dead starts with Theosophy, a sort of 19th century New Age religion that taught the oneness of all beings, as well as reincarnation and karma. It was very much influenced by Hinduism. And then Theosophy took those ideas and combined those with an interest in mystical insight, in esoteric teachings, and occult experiences. In 1919, Walter Evans Wentz, a theosophist, traveled to North India and bought an old Tibetan manuscript from a monk. Not knowing any Tibetan himself, he found a translator, and together they produced what we know today as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that was first published in 1927. Although the text that he had found was not particularly significant in Tibet, it wasn't even part of the Tibetan canon, it did speak to Evan Wentz's theosophical sensibilities, and to many others in the West as well. The psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote a brief commentary, and Timothy Leary used it as a basis for a guidebook on LSD tripping, we better say, which in turn inspired the Beatles song Tomorrow Never Knows. In various translations, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has sold more than 1 million copies. Yet the scholar Donald Lopez has noted that the work Walter Evans Wentz entitled the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not really Tibetan, it's not really a book, and it's not really about death. Okay, that cryptic stain probably needs a little more explanation. Evan Wentz's volume turns out to be more a product of American spiritualism than Tibetan culture. He had added a long theosophical introduction to the translation, and the Tibetan text itself would have been used by only one of the 4 major schools, the Nyingma school, founded by Padmasambhava, as a supplement to more authoritative canonical texts. The manuscript that Evan Wentz had come across was part of a larger cycle of texts known as the Pardo Thotral, literally, liberation in the intermediate state through hearing. So it's not really a distinct book, and the text has never been fixed. There are many versions of varying lengths. The work belongs to a rather unique genre called terma, or treasure texts. These are documents that were thought to have been written by Padmasambhava back in the 8th century and then hidden by him in caves or lakes or pillars or even in the minds of his future disciples so that they could survive centuries of persecution and be rediscovered in later generations. Thousands of such texts have come to light since the 11th century, with the majority appearing in the 14th century. That was the time when an obscure mystic named Karma Lingpa claimed to have found a number of funereal texts, some of which would become known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But it's not really about death either. It's about rebirth. The text, which was read in the presence of someone on the verge of death, gave a detailed description of what they were about to experience and how they should respond. It speaks of 3 intermediate stages in the 49 days between death and rebirth. The first, at the moment of death, will be seen as clear light. If a person is able to recognize that as reality, he or she can be liberated from all future rebirths. But the temptation will be to flee in terror, and if that happens, over the next few weeks, the deceased will see a succession of 42 peaceful deities and 58 wrathful deities. Again, it's natural to feel confusion and fear, and if a person doesn't grasp the chance to join those deities in their Buddha worlds, then karma will take over, and he or she will be attracted by lights that lead back to the 6 realms of this world system, to be reborn as a god, a demigod, a human, an animal, a hungry ghost, or a hell being. So, as someone is dying, you read them this text, and they can understand what to expect, and they can plan out how they're going to respond to what's about to happen to them. I hope that at this point, you have a sense of the tremendous variety of sacred texts within the 3 Buddhist canons. But I want to conclude with a quotation that conveys one Buddhist's heartfelt response to the scriptures in his tradition. He's not any random Buddhist. I'm going to talk about Tsongkhapa, the great 14th century Tibetan scholar and reformer who wrote massive commentaries on classic works of Buddhist philosophy, as well as a multi-volume elaboration of Atisha's Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. At a time when there were all sorts of problems within the monastic orders, Tsongkhapa put equal emphasis on mainstream Buddhist teachings and on Tantra, and he required strict discipline of the monks. So no alcohol, no sex, no evening meals, no long naps, no magic. Eventually, Tsongkhapa founded the Gelug school, probably the dominant sect of Tibetan Buddhism in the modern era. The Dalai Lama, for instance, is a prominent line of incarnation within the Gelug school, though he's hardly the leader of Buddhists all over the world, despite the well-deserved prominence of the current 14th Dalai Lama. A few years ago, the Dalai Lama wrote a commentary on the Heart Sutra, and you may remember that's the short 1-page summary of perfection of wisdom teachings that's recited daily throughout China, Korea, and Japan, and Tibet. The Dalai Lama tried to express the depths of his own feelings by citing these lines from Tsongkhapa, his spiritual mentor, addressing the Buddha and thinking of his teachings preserved in the sutras and the Vinaya. He said, "And yet, as I contemplate your words, the thought arises in me, ah, this teacher, enveloped in a halo of light and brilliant with the glorious major and minor marks, has taught thus in his perfect Brahma melody. O Buddha, as your image reflects in my mind, it brings solace to my weary heart, like the cool moon rays to one tormented by heat." That's the sort of devotion, that's the sort of gratitude that comes when he thinks of the Buddha and the traces that he's left in the present world in the scriptures.